An Experiment in Criticism is probably one of C.S. Lewis's lesser read books, and that might be because he gave it such a boring sounding title, but I can tell you, it's chock full of delightful thoughts. In it, he talks about how, broadly speaking, there are two types of readers. The first type mainly only ever pick up a book when they're trying to burn some time, like if they're going to be waiting in an airport for a while. They might also read a book for its narrative alone, just to see what happens next. The second type of reader, however, will reread a book over and over for the sheer love of it. And of this type of reader, he says that the first reading of some literary work is often an experience so momentous that only experiences of love, religion, or bereavement can furnish a standard of comparison. Their whole consciousness is changed. Now he goes on to talk about how different books can cater to the interests of one or other of those two types of readers. But today on our Pulling Threads video, I wanted to look at his thoughts on one particular type of story, and that is the myth. For Lewis, a myth is a story that retains its ability to move you, no matter how it's told. And as an example of this, he tells the story of Orpheus, who went down to the underworld to try to retrieve his wife, who recently died. He summarizes it very simply, saying, "There was a man who sang and played the harp so well that even beasts and trees crowded to hear him. And when his wife died, he went down alive into the land of the dead, and made music before the king of the dead, till even he had compassion and gave him back his wife, on condition that he led her up out of the land without once looking back to see her, until they came out into the light. But when they were nearly out, one moment too soon, the man looked back, and she vanished from him forever." And Lewis feels that even this bare outline can have a powerful impression on somebody who has never heard the story before. However, he says that not all things mythological have this quality. In fact, he says that many things considered myths are shockingly cruel, obscene, or even silly. But some of the myths have this numinous quality about them that make them special. To help us understand what he means by these special myths, he lists the characteristics that they all should have. The first characteristic he mentions is that they need to be extra literary, and by that he means just what he said earlier, that they have a depth of meaning that extends beyond the mere wording of the story. The second characteristic he mentions is that the pleasure of the myth depends hardly at all on such attractions as suspense or surprise. Stories that use such common narrative contrivances often lose their value once you know the outcome. Like if you're watching a thriller and you know that the bad guy is going to come jumping out of a certain corner, it kind of loses its potency. The third characteristic of myths that Lewis talks about is that in them, human sympathy is at a minimum. Now, he doesn't mean that they have sociopaths running around in them. Instead, he says, we do not project ourselves at all strongly into the characters. So when he told that myth of Orpheus, we're not imagining that we are Orpheus. We instead feel indeed that the pattern of their movements has a profound relevance to our own life, but we do not imaginatively transport ourselves into theirs. The fourth characteristic he talks about is that myths are always fantastic. And of course he means that they deal with impossibilities and preternaturals. The fifth characteristic is that though they may be sad or joyful, they are always grave. And so myths would be one of the grave beauties that George MacDonald's Light Princess wouldn't be able to appreciate since she lacked gravity. And finally, he says that myths need to be awe-inspiring or numinous. Now, because he's defining a myth based upon the reader's experience, he acknowledges that what is a numinous myth for one person might not be a numinous myth for another. And he gives the example of two boys reading the same book but having different experiences. He says, where one finds only danger for the heroes and therefore is appreciating the narrative, the other may feel the awful or awe-inspiring. Where one races ahead in curiosity, the other may pause in wonder. He also mentions a couple more modern stories that he felt had the same mythic feel. Things like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or specifically the Ent and Lothlorien aspects of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. And now that you know how Lewis defines a myth, I thought I would flesh out his bare bones retelling of the Orpheus story by reading a little bit of Ovid's Metamorphoses. Now, if you haven't read the Metamorphoses, just know that it is beautiful and funny and aptly named, because all throughout the pages people are turning into little bits of nature. So I'll read his retelling of the Orpheus story, and you can decide if it has the same mythical gravity that Lewis was talking about earlier. And as usual, I'll be skipping around for both clarity and brevity. So Orpheus and Eurydice have just gotten married, and Eurydice decides to go off and hang out with her naiad friends. But that's when disaster strikes. Ovid says, "The new-wed bride, roaming with her gay naiads through the grass, fell dying when a serpent struck her heel. Orpheus spends a lot of time mourning her in the wide world above, but eventually decides to go down into the underworld to try to get her back. He came to pale Persephone, the queen of the underworld, and him, lord of the shades, who rules the unlovely realm. And as he struck his lyre's sad chords, he said, 'I have come down not with the intent to see the glooms of hell, nor to enchain the triple snake-haired necks of Cerberus, but for my dear wife's sake, in whom a trodden viper poured his venom and stole her budding years. Now by these vast regions filled with fear, by this huge chaos, these vast still realms, reweave, I implore, the fate unwound too fast of my Eurydice.' And he tells Hades that this is not an infringement on his sovereignty, because he knows that all of humankind will one day end up in this underworld under his authority. But he asks for the favor of having Eurydice return to him, and if he can't get that, he says he'll just stay in the underworld with her. So to the music of his strings he sang, and all the bloodless spirits wept to hear. And Tantalus forgot the fleeing water, and Sisyphus sat wrapped upon his stone. So Tantalus, who's always trying to get a drink of water which recedes from him, forgets about the water for a while. And Sisyphus, who's cursed to continually be pushing a stone up a hill only to have it roll back down again, sits upon the stone as is enraptured by the beautiful singing. Then first by that sad singing overwhelmed, the Furies' cheeks, it said, were wet with tears. And Hades' queen, and he whose scepter rules the underworld, could not deny the prayer, and called Eurydice. She was among the recent ghosts, and, limping from her wound, came slowly forth. And Orpheus took his bride, and with her this compact, that, till he reach the world above, and leave Avernus' vale, he look not back, or else the gift would fail. And so they began to climb the steep and gloomy path out of underworld. And now they neared the edge of the bright world, and, fearing lest she faint, longing to look, he turned his eyes, and straight she slipped away. He stretched his arms to hold her, to be held, and clasped, poor soul, naught but the yielding air. And she, dying again, made no complaint. For what complaint had she, save she was loved? And breathed a faint farewell, and turned again back to the land of spirits whence she came. The double death of his Eurydice stole Orpheus his wits away. And because he was heartbroken at his double bereavement, he actually goes on to spurn some women who were interested in him. And that's where Lewis ends his summary, but that's not the end of the story. Because later on, the women who he spurned find him. While Orpheus sang his minstrel songs and charmed the rocks and woods and creatures of the wild to follow, suddenly, as he swept his strings and conquered with his song, a frenzied band of Thracian women, wearing skins of beasts, from some high ridge of ground caught sight of him. "Look," shouted one of them, tossing her hair that floated in the breeze. "Look, there he is, the man who scorns us." One picks up a stone and throws it at him, but in mid-air it was vanquished by the strains of the voice and lyre, and groveled at his feet as if to ask pardon for frenzy's daring. So the stone flying at his face stops in mid-air because of the sheer beauty of his voice and singing, and falls to his feet apologetically. Even so the reckless onslaught swelled, and still his singing would have charmed every weapon, but the huge clamor, the drums, the curving Phrygian fifes, hand-clapping, Bacchic screaming, drowned the lyre. And then at last, his song unheard, his blood reddened the stones. And the women begin to kill the animals that are mesmerized by his singing around him. And then they go find anything around that they can attack him with, from clods of earth to stones. And eventually they come across farming equipment like rakes and hoes. And they go to attack him with those, since their loud tumult has drowned out his singing enough that they can actually hurt him. He pleaded then with his hands outstretched, and in that hour for the first time his words were useless, and his voice of no avail. In sacrilege they slew him. Through those lips that held the rocks entranced, that wild beasts understood, he breathed his last, and forth into the winds his spirit passed. The sorrowing birds, the creatures of the wild, the woods that often followed as he sang, the flinty rocks and stones, all wept and mourned for Orpheus. Forest trees cast down their leaves, tonsured in grief, and rivers too, men say, were swollen with their tears. And naiads wore, and dryads too, their mourning robes of black and hair disheveled. All around his limbs lay scattered. Hebrus' stream received his head and lyre, and floating by, so wonderful, his lyre sent sounds of sorrow, and his tongue, lifeless, still murmured sorrow, and the banks gave sorrowing reply. And eventually his head floats down the river and lands on the shore of the Isle of Lesbos, where a snake sees it and goes to strike it, but Apollo turns the snake into stone out of respect for Orpheus. But Ovid continues, saying, "The ghost of Orpheus passed to the underworld, and all the places that he had seen before he recognized again. And, searching through the Elysian fields, he found Eurydice, and took her in his arms with leaping heart. There, hand in hand, they stroll, the two together. Sometimes he follows her as she walks in front. Sometimes he goes ahead and gazes back, no danger now, at his Eurydice." So, did you think that was a gravely beautiful tale that is worthy of being called a myth by Lewis's definition? I think so. And Ovid continues the story, telling how Bacchus punished all the women for killing Orpheus by turning them into trees. And his description of that is both haunting and spellbinding, so it's something that you should go check out for yourself. Anyway, I'll see you next time. So when Lewis was listing the myths that he thought had this numinous quality, I was delighted to see that both the Eddas and the Kalevala ended up on that list. And that's fun for me because when I first read this book 10-15 years ago, I had no idea what they were. And now I've had years of delight in reading those books that he suggested, and I've also made videos about both the Eddas and the Kalevala, and I'll link a couple of them around here in case you want to check them out and haven't seen them yet.